Shalom, this is Beit Bamidbar, Messianic Outreach. My name's Gene, and this is Wednesday, um, April 29, 2025. I'm wearing glasses and still the print's kind of small. Anyways, we're going to be doing a discussion on tradition, and just as a general course, mainly because of stuff that's going on up here. I wanted to do something that would, get some terminology out and do some discussion about it. So um, let's go ahead and get started. I'll bring up the bulletin first. Get our smiling faces out of the way. You can do it. You can do it. Yay. All right. Um, ongoing activities. This bulletin is set for May 2nd or the 15th of ER 5786. And on Shabbat, that'll be the 29th of the Omer. Using the biblical system of counting, not the traditional system of counting, and other people's systems of counting. We currently meeting on Shabbat at 9:30 at the Veterans Homes, Idaho State Veterans Home. The address is here, so you're welcome to come. It's open to the public. We have our regular Shabbat Shachrit prayer for their announcements, discussion of the Parsha. And the readings for this week are here. Week 31, Emor is the Parsha. And of course, continually pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Now, on the other half of the bulletin, next week's reading is another double portion. We just did one last week, and we get to do another one next week. So it's Behar and Bechukotai, and we'll be reading those next week. So plan those for ahead. On the bulletin, we have weekly meetings. Make this as an announcement. We're going to be taking a vacation on the Wednesday evening online gatherings, and I'll let you know when that changes. But for now, we're going to be taking a break from it. So just be aware of that. So if you want to try to come on Wednesday, we're not going to be here. Okay, upcoming events. Later on this month, or next month, I should say, is Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and then you have Shavuot on the 23rd, which is a Saturday evening for the Feast of Weeks. We will be be following this on the biblical days, and that'll be happening then. After that, there's going to be a couple months, June, July, August, and into September, where there's nothing going on in the way of substantial traditional activities. Part of that, I believe, is God wanted us to have our time basically doing what He's telling us we should be doing. Is during the season, after Shavuot, we're going to be spending our time harvesting. In fact, even now we're beginning the harvest season. We begun that after Pesach, so we're already halfway through our season of harvesting the barley, and barley harvest ends about the time of Shavuot, and you pick up with the wheat harvest after Shavuot. So after that, you still have all the other produce that comes in and the harvesting. And so during the summer months, we don't have special holy days that are going to take up your activities from harvesting. And then come September, we will pick up again with the month of Tishrei, September 11, followed by that evening, Yom Teruah, the day of blasting. We're blowing shofars, and traditional has a name of Rosh Hashanah, although God said that the month of the Aviv, which we've passed already this calendar year, um, is the beginning of the beginning of the months, the way he calls it. But tradition puts it as September 11, Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So we'll let you know about that. Okay. All right. Any questions, comments, rebukes on the bulletin? Okay. Let me pull up. What gave me rise to want to do this today um, is the Messianic community, especially up here in North Idaho, is extremely fractured. And there are so many isms and schisms, the phrase I like to use. And there's so many different versions of what is the calendar. And and you have factions here that don't want to do anything from tradition because they think it's Jewish and therefore evil or not worthy of following. Um, and I try to point out when those discussions come up that we are full of traditions that we don't recognize are traditions because, um, you know, allegedly it's supposed to be, the person giving these lessons saying, it's new or it's, we don't do that stuff. And so I decided for this week, I wanted to just have a discussion on the question, is tradition bad? Because that's a topic that I come up with a lot here. Back in the old country in Southern California, we have a lot of traditional Messianic congregations. And you don't run into this question so much. Up here, there's a lot of new things coming around. So let's get into this. Is tradition bad? And so my opening comment is it sometimes comes up in religious conversation, the notion tradition is a bad thing. This usually is presented from Yeshua's own statements about tradition as found in Mark 7, verses 1 to 13. Shaul, Paul, spoke poorly of tradition in Galatians 1:14 and also Colossians 2:8, and as well as Kepha Aleph, 1 Peter 1:18. So for our text, let's take a look at what the terminology that's going on here, because the complaints that are going on in the text of the Brit Chadashah are specific to a particular issue, not tradition in general, but a specific issue. And so I want to start by saying let's declare the special issue, and let's see how it shows up here. So in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark, it says the Prushim and some of the Torah teachers who had come from Jerusalem gathered together with Yeshua and saw some of his Talmidim ate with ritually unclean hands. Ooh, that is, without doing netilat yadayim. For the Prushim and indeed all the Judeans holding fast to the tradition of the elders do not eat unless they have given their hands a ceremonial washing. Okay. So let's back up and cover this in a little more detail. Some of us here are familiar with Netilat Yadayim. It's the blessing. It's the activity you do. And a short explanation is in various different places. If you go to a kosher restaurant, there's usually a sink set aside somewhere towards the back. And on that sink is a cup with two handles. And so you go to the sink there and you fill up the cup with water from the sink, and with one hand on one handle, you rinse off your hand 3 different times, reciting a blessing. And then as you're doing that, you switch and you repeat the thing with the other hand. And without doing that tradition, you are considered to have unclean hands, and therefore the food you touch becomes unclean. So that's where the beginning of all this, it helps them to know the context before you do this. Okay. And so, and there's a particular blessing that's said with that, and it's, you know, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. Okay, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us regarding the washing of the hands, literally the taking of the hands. But the problem is, did God command us to do this? And so Yeshua, part of his activity, his shtick, if you will, is he is dividing what is God-breathed commandment from what is man-invented tradition. So we have a position here from our Messiah who's taking tradition at a lesser light than what some other people will require of us if we wanted to follow their ways. So you get the impression that Yeshua is anti-tradition, but that's not the case. Okay, because he did fulfill other things. He did act in some ways along with tradition. For example, reading out of the Haftarah portion out of the book of Isaiah while he was in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. Okay, so he went with some of the things that are tradition. The Sabbath day, God called holy. So, and then how you do that, of course, is you went to the shul, you went to the synagogue, and you hung out there. And it's even in Acts 15, it's admitted even in their own Messianic communities that they teach the Torah, they teach the Bible every synagogue, every Sabbath day. So this was a norm even within Messianic circles. Okay, Yeshua never complained about them having Sabbath services and reading out of the Torah. Now, there are other traditions that the Prushim and the Sadducees did that he did complain about, and this is one of them. Okay, so the Pharisees said, "Oh, you have unclean hands because you guys didn't do this ceremony," and Yeshua answers with this. We get into our reading here. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is useless because they teach man-made rules as if they were doctrines. And there is the rub. There is the problem. These are the man-made rules as if they were doctrines. Okay, if the tradition of Netilat Yadayim was stated as, this is a tradition we have developed, as a way of cleansing our hands before we sit down and eat. And it's our tradition, and we did it. Then you can say, okay, I like that. We can do with this. I can do that. Or you can say, I wash my hands as a normal thing before I sit down to eat. So why would I need a special blessing for that? If you made it a little more optional, it would be easier to deal with. But in modern Orthodox Judaism, it's not optional. You suffer the stigma of having unclean hands if you don't do this ritual. Okay, and so Yeshua's quoting scripture by saying, that you're worshiping God in vain. It's actually, this is God speaking in the citation, worshiping God in a useless fashion because you're teaching man-made traditions as if they were equal to, and in some cases superior to, God's commandments, at least in function. They may deny it, but it's how you deal with it. There's more energy enforcing Netilat Yadayim than there is some other commandments that are biblical, straight from God. Okay, so verse 8, back into our basic text here. You depart from God's command and hold to human tradition. Okay? Indeed, he said to them, you have made the art of departing from God's command in order to keep your tradition. For Moshe said, honor your father and your mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say, if someone says to his father or mother, I have promised as a korban, that is a gift to God, that I might have used to help you, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus, with your tradition, which you have handed down to you, you nullify the word of God, and you do other things like this. So the basis of Yeshua's complaint is your tradition causes you to nullify the command of God. And he makes for the example the issue of korban. Now, korban simply means destruction in Hebrew, but what the function of the word in this context is that you set aside something to be given to God as a whole gift, whether it's cattle or food or anything really that you would think to promise to give to God, and you, in a sense, you promise that to God, so you sort of set it up, set it over for destruction that is being removed from you, thus allowing for the money that you would have been needing to spend to take care of your father and your mother in their old age. You have dedicated to God, and therefore it's not available to you, and you are now free from your requirement to honor your father and mother because you've taken what would have been spent for their care and dedicated it to God. So you're thinking, okay, that sounds bad enough on the surface, but what's the real kicker? What's the real thing on this? And the thing is after mom and dad are gone, you can redeem back what you have promised. Okay? After they're gone, you can redeem back what you've promised with a 20% fee. So for whatever it is that you had promised would be dedicated to your parents, you give 20% of that to the priest, and the rest you can keep back for yourself. And so this was, I don't know how you'd put it politely, this was a scam to hang on to your money, but it disregards your responsibility to take care of your father and mother, to honor them by caring for them in their time of need. Okay? So Yeshua uses this as the class example of how you bend and destroy the commandments of God in order to support your own tradition. Okay, so first he cites Netilat Yadayim, the tradition of washing the hands, and then both of these are supported in the Mishnah, by the way. That you can work out a deal to deny your father and mother's requirement of your financial support because they're elderly and they need your care, and work out a way that you can bypass that and not be responsible for it. And they do that with the statement, the money that have the field or the cattle or whatever it is that you have of value that I would have used to pay for my parents' care, I have dedicated to God as korban. Okay, knowing full well that after mom and dad are gone, you can ransom back the 80% of what you had set aside. So that's pretty rough. Okay. Another comment on that. That was kind of a long section there. Any questions, comments, rebukes so far?
Yeah, Cheryl had a question or a comment.
No, I was going to say, I mean, because I didn't hear honoring, like, the 10 Commandments, honor your mother and your father. But
yeah.
Where does that come in?
Well, within religiosity, man-made tradition, overwrites God's command.
It's true.
And that's not true only for Orthodox. This is true for every religious organization. you have people invent ways to avoid doing what God says. Okay. Sometimes by redirection, when's the last time you sat in a church when they told you that tithes and offerings were owed to the local congregation or to the pastor? Yet there's nothing in the scripture that gets even close to explaining that. Okay. That's a tradition. Okay. If you hate all traditions, that's one tradition you really need to consider avoiding. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments, rebukes?
Not at this time.
Okay. Let's continue on our base texts. Okay. Colossians 2:8. Watch out so that no one will take you captive by means of philosophy and empty deceit, following human tradition, which accords with the elemental spirits of the world, but does not accord with the Messiah. Okay. So here's another warning for us to not follow man-made tradition or philosophies, and with the constant reminding to us through Messiah that what he is saying is stick to the scriptures. Stick to the scriptures. Okay, stick to the Bible. So that's the main point. Tradition can be helpful. Okay. I've often mentioned when it comes to discussion of tradition, there's a tradition of lighting candles shortly before sundown on Friday afternoon. And for me, it's been a nice, useful tradition. Nowhere do you find it in the scripture, but it's a nice, useful tradition because for me, it sets the mental demarcation. When you light the candles, you mark in your mind that the work week is over and the Sabbath has begun and our rest has begun. And for me, that's a precious moment. Okay. And so I find that very useful. So I have no reason to want to cancel that tradition just because it's tradition, because I find it useful to enjoy it that way. And so there's a useful place for tradition, and there can be a damaging place for tradition if it prevents you from doing what God really wants you to do. Okay, our next reading is Kepha Aleph, First Peter 1:18. You should be aware that the ransom paid to free you from the worthless way of life which your fathers passed on to you did not consist of anything perishable like silver or gold. Okay. So here's what Peter is getting at. He's establishing a yes and no demarcation between tradition and Bible. You should be aware that the ransom paid, the Messiah's death and resurrection, to free you from the worthless way of life, which is adherence to a tradition that doesn't have a biblical commandment behind it, which your fathers placed on you. Okay. So Peter is not antinomian, against Torah, but he is against tradition that gets in the way. And so we need to look at his statement here is being just that. Okay. So we're going to get to the conclusion here, and this is actually the question for our discussion. What little Yiddish knew, which means so. How should we regard tradition when we are presented with traditional prayer services and practices in our Messianic communities? Okay. Well, if we take, just a few verses as our conditional answer, so the answer is the first step is to define the word tradition. Tradition. Okay. And it's found in Mark 7:3. So for the Prushim, and indeed all the Judeans, holding fast to the traditions of the elders, do not eat unless they have given their hands a ceremonial washing. Also, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they have rinsed their hands up to the wrist, and they adhere to many other traditions, such as washing cups, pots, and bronze vessels. So again, Yeshua is complaining about the traditions. He's not saying forget the commandments, but he says watch out for the traditions. And some of these, clearly Yeshua had an issue with. Again, we're back on Netilat Yadayim, washing the hands, because that tradition misses the point. Okay. Now, if you come in to eat and you got a little schmutz on your hands, yeah, you want to wash your hands. But to say that you have to because your hands are instantly filthy, not necessarily always true. You may have washed your hands just before you got there. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do with the word tradition there in the Greek text is paradosis. And I expect you all to be expert at that word by the time we're done today. So, tradition, then, the word paradosis is giving up, that is, giving over, or the act of giving up the surrender of cities, more directly, but secondarily, number two, a giving over which is done by word of mouth or in writing, that is, tradition, by instruction, narrative, precept, etc. A, objectively, that which is delivered, the substance of a teaching. B, of the body of precepts, especially ritual, which is the opinion of the later Jews of the later Jews were orally delivered by Moses and orally transmitted in unbroken succession to subsequent generations, which precepts, both illustrating and expanding the written law, as they did, were to be obeyed with equal reverence. And this is Dr. Stern's, no, that's from Blue Letter Bible, sorry. That's the official definition of tradition from Blue Letter Bible. Okay, and the point here is right in the middle is the big part, is those things that were allegedly delivered by Moses and have equal value to God's written commandments. And that's where that's the point, that's the rub between what Yeshua is talking about and what modern Messianics have issue with modern tradition. Okay, it's not that modern Messianics have an unjustified point of view, because some of the things clearly are strange, but there's lacking a maturity of understanding to see more than one side of the issue. It's not just because it's tradition, it's wrong. But the issue would be we need to weigh the traditions and regard them, consider them, and the ones that could be useful should be permissible, and the ones that are not useful, not useful, could be set aside without pain or issues. Okay. All right. Anything else that you want to bring up? Questions, comments, rebukes?
Yeah, I have something. Why are they synonymous for Jews only?
I do not agree at all with that point of view. So it's hard for me to understand where that comes from, except if there's a desire to keep Gentiles separate from Jews, even within Messianic Judaism. So one of the arguments is because you're a Gentile, you're not responsible to keep the commandments, including the traditional ones. And that's not the case. If you understand the context, which we've been talking about, Yeshua said, you know, you're not required to follow those traditions. Okay, they're man-made doctrines, so don't treat them as if they are God's commands, which puts you into a permissive response that you may, if you wish, pursue these traditions, and some you may find useful, helpful, and some you may not. Okay, so you are free to not take the tradition, and you're free to follow it if you wish. And you may find that you may like to do the observe the focus of the core of that tradition, but not necessarily all the steps therein. Um, you know, um, and so as a believer, we're free to regard um, the traditions as more as commentary or permissive, um, or maybe a good idea if you like that, but you're not under a requirement. And the reason that it's because some people still like to separate Jews and Gentiles, even in the Messianic community, by saying that Jews need to do this and Gentiles don't. Frankly, you know, if you're a Gentile and you want to do some of the more permissive things, um, that actually shows in a very good way that you're taking seriously your relationship as being grafted into Israel. Okay, because some of those traditions are useful for Israel, they should also then be useful for the Gentile. Even if it's not a commandment, it could be useful. It might be.
It's like it's just like the Shema and having what you call what the menorah on we whether you're Jew or Gentile, you are respectful
Yeah.
of that. However, is that a tradition or is that I can't say it's commanded. We're not well, yes, well, yeah, in the Shema it says to write it on to write it on our hearts, but as it's as a
Yeah.
reminder too. So it's kind of like, how do you define what is tradition and
Yeah.
what is not?
Yeah. Well, the Bible doesn't say you must stand when you recite the Shema.
No.
So it's tradition. And so and some people think it's an overdoing the tradition by asking people to stand when you recite the Shema. But if you understand the context, and the intent is that we treat the Shema as something as very serious and very, very core to our relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
So is it that important that it's worth standing while you recite it? Yeah, it could be. You know, I would not, if I was leading the prayer service and I noticed that some people were not standing when we recited the Shema, I wouldn't stop everything and give everybody a lecture that you have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that everybody needs to answer, for themselves in their own heart and mind. Um, so, um, so at least I wouldn't do it. And some people will say, it would be proper to say it's tradition to stand while you recite the Shema, and pretty much leave it at that. That would be the most accurate way of saying it, instead of trying to convince people that they must stand or Gentiles cannot stand because they're not Jews. Okay. Okay. Any other questions, comments, rebukes? Okay. Are there any mention? Are there mention of tradition as a positive in the Bible? Okay. 1 Corinthians 11:2. Paul's writing to the congregation in Corinth. Now I praise you because you have remembered everything I told you and observed the traditions just the way I passed them on to you. So here Paul is passing on traditions, and he labels them as traditions, in that he is congratulating the Corinthian congregation for hanging on to those traditions, which knowing Shaul would be specific activities that help you in your walk, and can be done as a group, as a congregation. And so here's a positive statement. Okay, and again, 2 Thessalonians 2, also 3:6. Therefore, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions you were taught by us, whether we spoke them or wrote them in a letter. So again, impressing on the listeners of this letter to hold to the traditions that Shaul and the others were giving. Okay, and skip to verse 6. Now, in the name of the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, we command you, brothers, to stay away from any brother who is leading a life of idleness, a life not in keeping with the tradition you received from us. Okay, we don't have a lot of specific explanation of what this idleness is talking about. So I'm not going to guess and speculate. But the idea is this was an activity that Paul and the others that were teaching there were making as a tradition to not be idle. Okay. Okay. So WWJD, actually the way we would do it, WWYD. Did Yeshua keep traditions? Okay. The Shabbat at the synagogue, reading from the prophet scroll, Luke 4:17. Actually starting on 16. Now when he went to Natseret, where he had been brought up, on Shabbat he went to the synagogue as usual. As usual. Let me point that out. As usual. It was his tradition. Okay. I know I'm making this painfully obvious, but we're on that topic. So he stood up to read, and he was given the scroll of the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written. And the story goes on from there. But the point is, here is Yeshua involving himself in the tradition of going to shul on Shabbat. Okay? Nowhere is there a commandment that you must spend every Shabbat at a shul. Okay? So he was, and then he went along with the tradition that reading out of the prophet scroll, he was given the opportunity to read out of the scroll as part of the prayer service. Okay. So he reads out of the scroll, and then for our discussion, the events of that day go off in a different direction, and so we don't need to follow that the rest of the way. Okay. Any other questions, comments, rebukes before we go on? Okay. The last bit here is the big question. How do we determine if a tradition is good or bad? How do we decipher this? How do we get to it? Okay. Heaven can open up and angels could be singing and a dove comes down and tells you something. That's good. But if you want to have a good understanding of what tradition is good or bad, we have to look at it. I settled it down to 4 questions, and in developing this, I realized that half of these are repetitive. So off we go. Okay, number 1, does a tradition provide a means to keep a commandment? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, for example, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Okay, it is a holy convocation, meaning a mikre kodesh. It means a separated gathering. Okay, so is it a good idea as a means of fulfilling that tradition? Is it a good idea to gather on a Sabbath day? Mm-hmm. For whatever activity you're going to be doing, is it good to meet on a Sabbath day? Yeah. Okay. but it's not a tradition to be in the synagogue. Okay. I mean, it's not a commandment to be in the synagogue. It's a tradition. So can that be good? Could it be bad? Well, if you don't like the congregation, it might be bad. Item number 2, does a tradition prevent the keeping of a commandment? Okay. Now think about that. Okay, we just had Chag Matzot not too long ago. Okay. Are there traditions amongst Passover that might keep you from keeping a commandment? Okay. Is there tradition that might prevent you from actually keeping a commandment, specifically with Passover? Potentially. Amongst the traditions that are out there, that it's permissible to put all your yeast products in a cupboard and close up the door so you can't open it accidentally, and you keep it up there for a Passover week, and that's a tradition. And so after, when Passover is over, the week is over, you just open up your cupboard, put all the yeast back into where it used to be, and that's a tradition. Now, does that tradition really help us keep the commandment? Why? Well, what is the commandment? You're not supposed to find yeast within your dwelling. You're not supposed to have any yeast in your dwelling. And you have traditions that try to avoid that by saying if you store your yeast in the garage, it's not technically your dwelling, so you're keeping the commandment. Okay. Or even better, you can sell your yeast to the rabbi and you can keep it in your place because it's his yeast, not yours. Okay. And then when that week is over, you can buy back your yeast and use it again. Is that commandment helping you keep the commandment? What does it prevent you from giving you a means for not keeping the commandment? Okay. Item number 3, does a tradition provide a means to avoid violating a commandment? Okay. It's kind of the same as number 1. I realized after writing this and set this all up, this is kind of a repetitive, but in a different angle. Does a tradition provide a means to avoid violating a commandment? So how do you do this? Okay. For instance, the tradition is you're supposed to, spend the month before Passover cleaning up your house. This tradition of spring cleaning seems to come from this. You go through your house and you go through absolutely everything and you clean everything out. And you read all the labels on all the food in your pantry and in your freezer or your fridge. And you read for the labels for yeast, and you set aside all that because it's all going to go away. Okay. Does that tradition help you from violating a commandment? Absolutely. Because once you've identified all the yeast in your house, you have a means, you now have the opportunity to get rid of it. So it helps you from violating the commandment of not having any yeast in your place. Okay. Number 4, does a tradition prevent the means to avoid violating a commandment? Okay. I realized after writing this, I think I did a double negative here. Does a tradition present the means to avoid violating the commandment? Again, like we talked about for Passover. Okay. You clean up your house ahead of time. So you remove it ahead of time. You remove it early. So now you can avoid. You're avoiding violating the commandment because through the tradition of doing the house cleaning. Okay, and that's the same issue as the prior couple, but that's kind of the idea. And I wanted to do this just to give some language to how we should think about whether we should follow a tradition or whether we should not. And so this is my first try at trying to explain that. And maybe next go around I'll have fewer numbers. I can probably do it all with just the first 2. And that would simplify everything enough. So my final comment on that, any questions, comments, or rebukes on my list of considerations or anything else so far?
Yeah, you may even add one more. Is it wise to um uh plan a trip and go away during the week of Pesach, so you can just close the door behind you and not bother, so you're going to be going over to somebody else's hummus.
Yeah. Yeah. The difficulty is, you're talking about the kosher for Passover cruises, stuff like that. The problem
Yeah,
with that is the commandment also includes the statement, "There shall be none found in your household."
right.
You should, and you think, well, since we're not there, it's not going to be found. But there's also the commandment, "You shall have no yeast in your house." So even if you stay away for the week, you still have the commandment to not have it there. Um, and so it's a way of getting around violating the commandment, but in that case, it's not necessarily a proper way of getting around violating the commandment. If you follow me on that, it's
Yeah.
kind of like a double
Well,
negative.
yeah. Well, there's another thing now. I understand. I don't know if it's the Orthodox or who said it. I think, well, somebody from the congregation said that they heard that finally the rabbis are saying that having or using baking powder, baking soda is not, uh, in violation of the commandment.
Yeah.
And so,
Um,
however, before this, they were saying that it was, and one of the things that,
It was the Ashkenazi.
yeah, well, for the Ashkenazi, yeah. But what I thought was funny was, however, because baking soda has multi-purpose, not only for food to add to your food, but it's also a cleaning agent.
yeah.
And so they said just put your baking soda underneath your kitchen sink to look like a cleaning agent.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Here's to answer that question specifically. Within tradition, there are two words used when you're talking about leaven. One is chametz, which is yeast. And the other is
Mhm.
chometz, which is the thing that is yeasted. Okay, the thing that is yeasted. Um, and you have tons of kosher for Passover products that use baking powder or baking soda because it's a chemical reaction, not a live yeasty action. Because the baking powder, baking soda, they react to the heat of your cake being cooked, and that creates gases, which bubbles up the dough, and you end up with a texture somewhat similar to yeasted bread. Um, but it's using chemicals rather than. And so you have Passover, kosher for Passover bread products that use baking soda or baking powder. And I've known that for a long time. I wasn't really aware that it was an Ashkenaz tradition to say no to that, but I wouldn't be surprised. But if they finally decided, well, it's really not, then you know you still have the same difference at this point. Okay. Any other questions on this?
Nope.
Okay. Final comment. Um, earlier on, I questioned, the WWYD, and I decided to modernize it as WDYD. What did Yeshua do? Okay. So, did Yeshua follow some traditions and deny others?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm gonna answer the way Yeshua did. Go and do likewise, or don't do go and do or don't likewise. Okay,
Yay.
that's it for our topic. I hope that's useful.
I
And
liked it.
Yeah.
very good. I hope it gives you some terminology with which to work on how you decide, looking at things and things we do or things we don't do, um, which are either forbidden or permitted depending on the season or the holy day. Um, Hopefully, it gives you good means for figuring that out. One question, ask. It's always good to discuss it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let me turn off the recording and let's see. Oops, that's not it. Oops. Here we are.